2, 1.
Welcome to HBTV. I'm Harry Binswanger, the HB in HBTV. Today is Ask Harry Anything, and we have a long list of very interesting questions. I want to begin with the last one because it can be answered quickly. Monkey teach, monkey learn is the handle. He asks, Atlas is a great work of art, meaning Atlas Shrugged. The Daily Wire, who's got an option to produce a mini-series of it for a video series. The Daily Wire is likely to vandalize Atlas with their film. Yes, I think that's correct. Would the rational and moral response be to use force to prevent the Daily Wire from vandalizing Atlas with their film? No, of course not, because they're doing it with the permission of the owners of the rights. So just as a person could vandalize his own work, like, well, of course, that was a little different, but in The Fountainhead, Howard Roark blows up the disfigurement of his housing project as a test case and waits to be arrested because he wants to go to trial. But in principle, if you own a painting, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. It's yours to throw away, disfigure, whatever. It can be very immoral to do one of those things, but ownership rights are ownership rights. This is a subsidiary or derivative right from the right of the owner. So no, you could not possibly use force except as an act of vandalism yourself. Well, as an act of vigilantism, but it wouldn't even qualify as that, as a violation of property rights. So no, absolutely not. Ignore it. Josh Dixon asks a very interesting question. What's the difference between working memory and the crow? Now, for those of you who don't know the in-group terminology, the crow is shorthand for the limitation in focal awareness of the number of units you can keep separate and distinct and work with at once. Ayn Rand pointed out that the conscious mind can only work with a limited number of units, certainly not more than 7. So if you have 7 people who are asking you questions and you're trying to keep track of 7 questions at once, you're probably not going to do it. But 2 people, you could certainly do it. And 200 people and 200 questions, you certainly couldn't do it. Or if you're presented, I'm now holding up a certain number of fingers, you can easily perceptually tell how many that is. And if I remove one, you know it. But now suppose I had a plate with 87 peas on it. And while your head is turned, I take away 1 pea and now there's 86. Could you tell the difference? No. So there's a limit on the number of units being separate members of a group that have, but similar because they have something in common with the other members, so they form a group. There's a limit on the number that you can hold in one frame of conscious awareness at once, at one moment. You can't juggle more than a certain number of balls at once. And that is called the crow because it came from an experiment or an observation made in actually the late 19th century. And you can find the reference in Nature magazine, which I won't go into the story, but what it amounted to is that crows could keep track of whether it was 3 men or 4 men, but beyond that, they couldn't tell the difference between 4 men and 5 men or 5 men and 6 men. And so it's called the Crow epistemology, that there's a limit on the number of separate items that you can hold distinctly in awareness and differentiate from a different number of them. So obviously you can look at a whole football stadium full of people and see them all at once, but you can't see them as individuals. And if you look back, you say, oh, well, the guy in the 16th row of the over there must have gone to the concession stand because he's missing. No, just a spread. Or you look at a field of grass. You can't keep them distinct. But my 3 fingers, you certainly can. So that turns out to be of enormous importance, because concepts refer to an unlimitedly large number of things of the same kind. So how do we form concepts, and why are we able to do it, and what's the importance of it? And the importance of the whole conceptual level is it transcends the crow. It gets around the crow limit. You reduce a table, all the tables you'll ever encounter, to one word: table. And when you say tables are flat, you've dealt with potentially unlimited number of things in reality that you could never deal with perceptually. Actually, but you've done it through the concept. Actually, the crow example shows that better than my example. What does a human being do? How come he can keep track of, say, whether it's 83 or 82? Because he can count, and he can reduce the quantity to 1 unit, or maybe the 1 unit with 2 subunits, 83. 2 words, 83. And he knows how many that is, and he has a process counting to identify whether something is 83 or 82 or 84. So the value of numbers is that it enables us to deal with more than we can perceptually distinguish. So you can send, like the moon. Which looks to be further away, the moon or Paris? Now, you can't see Paris, but take something in the great distance. You look at the moon, you look at something across a vast distance, you can't really be sure. It's hard to tell because there's no background for the moon, just sky. But we can measure the moon precisely enough to send a rocket there, and we can know how much the rocket weighs, even though it's way beyond what we could heft and distinguish. And we know how much fuel there is, even though it's more than we can look at. And we can know the rate of burn, even though you can't grasp any of that on a perceptual level, all because we can condense units into many, many, potentially unlimited number of units into 1 word or 1 number. So the entire thing that raises up human beings above the animals, the reason why we have homes and clothing and smartphones and cameras and cars and medicines, the whole reason why we have that and crows don't, is that we can transcend the limit of the perceptual level by letting a concept named in a single word stand for an unlimited amount of information. So that's the crow. But the question was, what's the difference between that and working memory? Now, this is me answering. This is not part of objectivism. I don't think the concept of working memory is correct for the human mind. I think the concept that is relevant here is activation energy. you have a certain amount of ability of energy to bring up items from the subconscious, items stored in the brain. And if you start activating certain things, other things fade. So if you want to think about rulers of France in bygone days, and you think, well, there was, of course, Louis XVI, the sun god, but there was also Henry of Navarre, and then in a sense, Charles de Gaulle was kind of a ruler. And you start thinking about that, thoughts of fish, if you had them, have gone. You've activated, you've energized a certain area of connections in your brain, and that makes it more likely that things pertaining to France and rulers and politics and society and geography will come to mind, and thoughts about fish and recess at school and the Pythagorean theorem are not going to be as likely to come to mind. So I use this concept of activation energy, and it refers to the ability to the ease of recalling something. And it takes energy, in some sense of that term, to pull up material from the brain, the subconscious. And you don't have an unlimited amount. That's the point. Just as you can't hold an unlimited number of things in mind in focal awareness, so you can't say, well, I'm switching on my whole subconscious. Everything is fully activated and ready to come to mind. It's right. Everything is on the tip of my tongue. No, you've got certain things that are highly activated, and the things well connected to them are somewhat activated, and the things well connected to them, or the things that are not so well connected to the first item, are slightly activated, and it spreads out through the network of your connections in your brain so that it's easy to bring some things to mind and hard to bring other things to mind. And some things will come to mind automatically, and those are the ones that may be the most fruitful. But what comes to mind automatically depends upon the context that you have activated. And the context is the network of connections. So for example, if for me, imaginary strongly right now brings up number, because I'm working the philosophy of math. But I bet for you, imaginary brought up the Wizard of Oz, or you feel certain things that you've connected to imaginary start to get higher closer to consciousness. So I don't think there's a place, like in a computer, there's RAM, random access memory. And that's a much smaller amount of memory than your hard drive or whatever, cloud drive, which has huge amounts of memory. But the stuff that's in the working memory in a computer is all there, and it's all pretty equally close and ready and fast access into the CPU registers, which is like the focal awareness of the computer, the analogy to focal awareness of the computer. So I don't think the human brain works that way. Remember, a computer works by addressing information. So everything in a computer that you want to get from storage or from memory has an address. And the computer can go get it, can fetch what's in location A37B654 in memory. We don't work that way. We work by association, by what's connected to what. And therefore, working memory is not a chunk of memory where everything is put that you expect to be using now, and then you flush that out and bring in other. It's an activation of part of a network, and if the things connected to it are somewhat energized, and it spreads out. So I think of it as like pulling a net up, and the net is attached to everything you know. So, of course, right where your fingers are, that stuff is pulled right up into focal awareness. The things that are connected to it are on the edge of awareness. But even things not high enough above the threshold to be in awareness are raised up a little. And things way remote are not. So I think there's a limit not on the quantity of items in a working memory, but there's a limit of energy, of activation energy that you've got. So to start activating some thoughts and some contexts and some connections will cause others to be less activated and hence less likely to come into awareness unless you initiate a search for them. You can always say, well, wait a minute, fish. What do I know about fish? And start deliberately energizing that set of items that are, I gave as an example, something that wouldn't be there if you activated something. You can deliberately, that's your part of your free will. You can frame a question to yourself. What are the main parts of an automobile motor? Well, obviously, carburetor, manifold, spark plug wires. Doesn't have to have a radiator, or might be air cooled. And you can go on from there, and I've now activated a bunch of knowledge of connections that I have. So you can move that energy, but you can't expand that energy, at least not very much. You can't, tentuple it. You can't start flipping switches on, even with meth, and start, activating everything. And it's a good thing you can't, because you'd be driven crazy by it. So that's the difference. It's not working memory in the crow. It's things in focal awareness, things in fringe awareness, things out of awareness but close, things right at the threshold of the level of activation of awareness, things further and further unactivated, out of it, away from awareness. And the limitation, which I call the raven by analogy to the crow, is you have a limited amount of activation energy that you can use. You can't activate everything equally. Your totality of knowledge cannot be all activated. So that's a long answer, but I think it's a really interesting subject, and it gets to how the mind works. Jonathan Honig asks, did Miss Rand ever mention the Brandens with you? Yes. And the relevant thing I think you'd want to know is that at one point when, first of all, I was not in Ayn Rand's inner circle at the time. I was just in the next rung outside at the time of the split between Barbara Branden, Nathaniel Branden on one hand, and Ayn Rand and her associates on the other, which is familiar to most of you. If it isn't, it's really not that important historically. But it wasn't long after that I got to know her better, and it was 10 years after that I really got to know her and was spending time with her. And the part that I think is interesting is at one point, Barbara Branden contacted her and said, let's meet. And to my amazement, she said, okay. I mean, I don't know the word she used, but she accepted it. And when I heard about it, I said to her, in an uncharacteristic display of manliness or standing up to Ayn Rand, who was 40 years older than me and extremely powerful presence. I said, if Barbara Brandens coming back, I'm leaving. And she said something on the order of, what do you take me for? You know, that wasn't a possibility. So I talked to her the next day, and she said that they had met and it went, you know, fairly okay. And I said, what does she want from you? And she said, I don't know, some kind of forgiveness, I think. And I don't know if I asked her, she volunteered, but she didn't give it to Barbara Branden, who was, the important thing is that this break involved an exploitation of Ayn Rand and lying to Ayn Rand by the people that she had given the most to, but immense betrayal. So she was not in any way forgiving Barbara. And then a couple weeks later, she told me she got a phone call from Barbara saying that she was writing a biography of her, of Ayn Rand, and would Ayn Rand cooperate with that, or did she want to have any input or something like that? And Ayn Rand was furious, and she said, I said, don't ever call me again, and I slammed the phone down. That's what she told me right after it happened. And the way that Barbara tells it in her book is rather different. She said, in her book, Barbara Branden wrote a book. Knowing, finally a telephone, but she refused to speak to me. No, that is not true. She did speak to her. And Barbara says, I was certain that her refusal must stem from anger at the prospect of my writing biography. It certainly did. But many months later, I happened to be speaking to an acquaintance who had a business relationship with Ayn. Quote, Ayn was in the office to talk about a business matter, he told me, and she said, Barbara was in New York a while ago. We spent a day together. She's going to write my biography. She said it perfectly calmly. There was no anger in her voice or manner. How does Barbara know she wasn't there? And then we went back to our discussion. This is Barbara quoting somebody who told her so. I can only assume that if anger was her initial reaction, her attitude later changed. No, it did not change. That is one of the many very dishonest things in her book, which I'm sorry I even mentioned. So yeah, she mentioned this encounter. I was amazed that she would even speak to her. Nathaniel Branden remarried after his wife died, and the new wife, he remarried like within 6 months. His new wife, Devers, contacted Ayn Rand, wanted to meet with her, and I think Ayn Rand did meet with her because she told me about the wife. At least she was human, in contrast to the earlier wife. But she wanted Ayn Rand to contact Nathaniel Branden, which she even listened to tapes if he sent her a tape, and Ayn Rand, had nothing to do with it. So yeah, there are things, but basically no. Very interestingly, I saw her a couple of times a week, I think, for maybe a year and a half in her apartment to play Scrabble and talk philosophy. And the only mention of the Brandens was when Barbara contacted her. So the way that the Brandens talk about it, I guess this is defensive to even going to this, that she conducted a vendetta against them. No, she never mentioned them. She was not concerned with them. It didn't come up. So they're just the people who betrayed her, and it's not just them, many, many people betrayed her. They're evil. Jerry Kinkor asks, what is the difference in the meaning of a concept, freedom, in Ayn Rand's definition of right, and a right to liberty? It looks like two different concepts, liberty and freedom, in this context. So what's the difference between freedom and liberty? I have a view. I don't know if it's official objectivism or not. I never heard Ayn Rand say this. It's not in any of the writings, but there's a need for two different concepts. Freedom is the absence of the initiation of physical force against you. It's the ability to act without fear of someone using physical force to stop you, including the government. Liberty, I think, the way I use it, is freedom from government. So it's narrower. A criminal takes away your freedom. If he ties you up, it takes away your freedom. And by implication, if he robs you, he takes away your freedom. You cannot use or sell or enjoy that which he has taken from you. But that's different. You wouldn't say, suppose somebody even won't let you leave you go into his apartment and he locks the door and won't let you out for a day. You wouldn't say, well, you took away my liberty. Doesn't that sound a little wrong? Took away my freedom. He imprisoned me. But liberty is political liberty. Liberty is liberty under government, liberty from government. So a right is defined by Ayn Rand as Sherry, maybe it's pronounced Yuri, implies. A right is a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. Now, that's not just about the government. That's against criminals and civil violations of your rights, but mainly criminals and foreign invaders. So I think there's a need for a concept that focuses on what government can do to you. And I think liberty is that. And then it makes sense to talk about the right to liberty. Michael asks, has Marxism been watered down in the same way, down in the West, in the same way Christianity has? No. Far from it. Why not? I mean, there are people who only partway agree with Marx, but then you wouldn't call them Marxists. Christianity got watered down because it lost. It lost intellectually. People no longer believe on faith, and some people still do, but basically the culture no longer accepts, you shouldn't shave your face because the Bible says you shouldn't. Don't cut your face with a blade. Now, there are Orthodox Jews who do believe that, but basically the culture, what you see, is pro-science. So Aristotle won, and religion had to retreat. It had to pose as the friend of science, or at least not the enemy. So in the beginning, religion fought. Galileo was arrested and kept in house imprisonment. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake. Even earlier, the Pope forbade the teaching of Thomas Aquinas's writings at the University of Paris. for some years. But the position of the church that faith is superior to reason was rejected, refuted. It was shown to be absurd. It could have been shown a little bit more strongly. But Marxism, now you might say, well, Marxism has failed. No, the Soviet Union failed, and it failed in its economic and political side. But are there any arguments around that have persuaded people that Marxism is intellectually wrong? No. No, and there can't be, because it's just altruism. So Marxism is merely altruism with a veneer of economic justification. But the real meaning of Marxism is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And other than Ayn Rand and her followers, who would stand up and say, no, need is not a claim. And ability is not something you have to do penance for. What's yours is yours. You live for your own sake. So there's nobody who will say that. Now, there are people who will say, oh, yeah, you don't have to reject evolution to be a Christian. Evolution makes sense. And they're the ones who control the culture, right? So the dominant philosophy of religion, the dominant epistemology, basically, of faith, is no longer accepted except in very backward and strange places. I mean, that's a little overstated, but it doesn't really have much cultural influence. But the basis of Marxism, altruism, is still absolutely ingrained. So no, it has not been watered down. The day when it is watered down, we'll know we're winning. He also asks, has Kant's influence been steadily declining since the publication of Atlas Shrugged? No. No, because you have to refute Kant, you have to have two things. One, the right epistemology, which almost no one knows because the academics won't look at it, and a rejection of altruism. And people are not willing to do that. So no, his influence has not, I don't think, been declining at all. What will a collapse, Michael says, into another dark ages look like? Dark. That's actually a good question. Let's hope we don't have to find out the answer. And I don't think we will. It's possible we'll collapse into a new dark ages, and it might come after a cataclysm. It probably would be. If we're going to collapse, there's going to come a time when people are starving, and they're going to rise up in rebellion against what they think is the problem, which is going to be greedy businessmen or government bureaucrats. And it's neither one. It's more government bureaucrats, certainly not greedy businessmen. It's the ideas, it's the universities that they should be attacking. So I don't think it's going to happen. I thought it was going to happen in 1969. I didn't think the country would last past 1976, if you know at all what the 60s were like, the late 60s. But I underestimated the rational elements in the philosophy, because it's not, as I say, Christianity lost. The Christian morality is still observed and held on to, but people are not like they were in the Middle Ages. They're more selfish than they were then. So I don't think it's going to collapse. I think we'll win eventually. How are we doing here? Because we're over time. Let's see if this is. That I don't know about. Oh, this is quick. And we'll have to have another session next Monday to do. Is the state forcing you to pay child support or alimony the initiation of force and rights violation? Certainly not child support, no. You, by your actions, undertake the chance that children will result, and it's your responsibility, both parents, you meaning the mother and the father, to see that that child is supported. So the rights of the child who did not choose to be born and is born in a state where he cannot provide for his own survival for many years, the people responsible for bringing him into a dependent state like that have to support him. Alimony, I say not necessarily, because it depends upon the specific law. But in principle, if a person enters into a marriage without a prenuptial agreement to the contrary, he chooses to make a contract that includes, if this ends, I'll pay alimony. If he doesn't want to do that, he doesn't have to get married. Now, some states are better than others. Some have, very tough and punishing alimony laws. But no, those are a matter of accepting the consequences of your chosen action, both of them. So let's stop there. There are some interesting further questions, like 8 of them, and we can take them up next week or maybe even sooner. Thank you for listening to me go on at great length in answer to all these questions. I'm trying to trim it down, but I have to hone my skills there. I hope to see you next week. Goodbye for this week.